All right. Welcome to this event by the Center for Philosophical Studies of History. My name is Georg Angel. I am the coordinator of the center, and I will also be today's moderator. More importantly, today's speaker will be Leonidas Tsilipakos with the topic, the history of our concepts after Wittgenstein and Foucault. Now, Leonidas is senior lecturer in sociology at the University of Bristol in the UK. His main research interests lie in theoretical and methodological issues in the social sciences, and here especially questions of social ontology and realism, and also in the conceptual clarification of the emotions and in the intersection between utopian thinking and the sociology of race. Now, of Leonidas' many publications that I encourage you to check out by yourself, I want to mention only a few of them that I think have a direct bearing on the philosophy of history and the philosophy of historiography. One of them is the paper Descriptive Accuracy in History, the Case of Narrative Explanations, which was published in 2020 in the journal Philosophy of the Social Sciences. And then Leonidas has also published on the topic of realism that is recently being discussed very widely in the philosophy of history again, and also arguably very fervently. And here he has published the paper Realist Social Theory and Its Losing Battle with Concepts, which was published in 2015 also in the same journal, the Philosophy of the Social Sciences. And he has also published a book on this topic, or that has a bearing on this topic, in 2015 with Routledge, which is called Clarity and Confusion in Social Theory, Taking Concepts Seriously. Now, this is the first session of our spring seminar of 2024. After today, the seminar will continue actually with the topic of realism on March 21st, when Adam Timmins from the University of York in the UK will be speaking about a Heath Robinson contraption, some problems with Roth's irrealism. Thereafter, on April 11, we will have Matthias Slavov from our very own University of Oulu speaking about the metaphysics of time lurking within historiography, considering the, in parentheses, equal existence of past, present, and future. And finally, on May 28, we will have Sefki Doan from the Scuola Normale Superiore di Pisa in Italy, speaking on In Between Marx and Hegel, Gramsci's Storicismo Assoluto, in parentheses, absolute historicism. Now, if you want to stay updated about our seminar and about all the other activities that we engage in at the Center for Philosophical Studies of History, please follow our social media. We have Facebook and X, formerly Twitter. So now I'm nearly done. Please, just a few technicalities. Please mute yourself during Leonidas' talk to avoid any unnecessary disturbance. And after the talk, which I think will take around 45 minutes, we will have a discussion session that I will moderate. If you have any question, comment, criticism, concern, please first indicate so in the chat. I will make a speakers list. When it's your turn, you can either speak up with or without your camera on, or write your question in the chat, and then I will read it out loud. And we will prioritize people who have not spoken yet in the speakers list. Okay, that was it from me. Thank you very much for being here, people, and especially you, Leonidas, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Georg. Unimati, thank you very much for having me at the center. It's my privilege and pleasure to be here. I want to talk about the history of our concepts after Wittgenstein and Foucault, and from your very kind presentation of some of my research interests, I think people will have gathered that there's a lot in these titles about concepts and concepts this and concepts that. So I'm sort of banging on about similar things, and in many ways, it's easier said than put to practice, or easier sort of pointed out than kept in mind. The kind of conceptual accuracy, the kind of conceptual carefulness that I'll be recommending. Now, having said that, what I want to do here, and let me start by sharing my my presentation. Can everyone see this? Great. Okay. So what I wish to do in the following 45 minutes or so, and I promise not to overstep that mark, is to sketch an area of overlap between Wittgenstein and Foucault. These are thinkers that are not necessarily thought together, and although I will go over some some tries at highlighting some commonalities by a number of theorists, let's say, and philosophers. And I also want to sketch a range of problems, but I'm afraid I don't have a very developed position that I'll be taking, apart from raising a number of questions that I think we can perhaps discuss together. The other point about Foucault and Wittgenstein is that in some ways, what it does is highlight, or treating those two together, is it sort of highlights the common ground of problems between philosophy, history, and the social sciences. And in fact, both in terms of the actual historical influences, but also in terms of the literature discussed, directly or indirectly, there are very significant areas of overlap. I will try and point out some of these as we go along. I will only say now that a lot of the early 20th century discussion in the social sciences about the role of theory and the role of empirical history is a constant feature throughout the 20th century and 21st century in discussions about how we should think about historical variability of concepts and how we should think about studying history and studying societies. All right. Now, let me start with Foucault, and Georg sort of told me that he might be the most, or before doing that, let me just say, so the structure of the talk is to talk a little bit about Wittgenstein and Foucault. And then some of the points I wish to linger on are this idea of holism, moderate holism, or in other words, this idea that our concepts are part of bundles of practices and uses and are not transportable as easily as sometimes thinkers may think. I'm going to talk a little bit about this idea of concepts having a history or being historical. Some thinkers refer to this as the historicality, others as the historicity of concepts. Then I'm going to skip the section in blue, which I realized is too long for me to include, but we can come back to that if you wish to talk about any of that. The questions raised in that section have to do with the relationship of the atemporal character of some of our grammatical rules or rules for the constitution of concepts, and the way in which that atemporality might present itself as a fake or a faux universality, or it might complicate the way in which we might apply our understanding to what it is we're studying, while also avoiding anachronism and other cardinal sins. And then I'm going to reach a partial conclusion, which I assure you will only be partial. All right, so I'll start with Foucault, who I was told is probably the most unknown or the less well-known of the two. Again, Foucault is a figure that's very well known in the social sciences in various ways. And of course, what he brings after the 1960s and 70s to the social sciences is a very strong concern with history. So what is his project? Well, it's difficult to say in one sentence, but one of the ways in which our categories of persons and identification of persons and the way in which we conceive of who we are shifts historically. That's one way of thinking about it in relation to different modes of knowing, different ways of vocabularies of science and human science and so on. That's very vaguely put. All right, but what's interesting about Foucault, of course, is that he's part of a milieu that is trained in the philosophy and history of science. And in fact, he has as a background, for example, the historical epistemologists such as Georges Canguilhem. And Canguilhem's points, or at least some of the points he makes, and which scholars emphasize, is first of all, the distinction between concepts and theories. So the idea that the vehicle of the focus of epistemological research is not the theory, but the concept, and the concept is something theoretically polyvalent. His complete disparagement of this type of history that looks for precursors, and in many ways what is a very Collingwoodian understanding of what it takes to have the same kind of line of investigation. So asking very much the same type of problems, or asking the same type of questions, having the same type of problems as a criterion for what counts as being in a similar line of scientific investigation on which it would make sense to identify precursors. So Canguilhem is in the background, but even further in the background is Nietzsche with his genealogy and his sort of genealogical method, let's say. It's not formulated very explicitly as such, but what Foucault does very much in his work is take that and conduct investigations in the Nietzschean mode. And that conception of history is also there, and it has a particular understanding of the kind of abrupt shifts or mutations or lack of universality, let's say, of certain anthropological facts. So it's a kind of history that doesn't take anything for granted, or in principle can historicize any and every part of our practices, from our work to how we make love, to how we talk about ourselves, to anything really. So it has a very strong historicist bent. That, of course, is part of the feature of the 19th century, and it's injected into more recent discussions in the social sciences through this way. It's also injected more recently in analytic philosophy, because there's especially in political theory and political philosophy, there's an interest in genealogy and even in the last couple of years, there's been a lot of work on that. Now, the kind of Foucauldian aspect that I want to highlight here is his 4-volume work on the history of sexuality. Now, this was written between 1968 and 1984 when he died, and it features a discussion of the ways in which sexual acts were thought of in classical Greece and imperial Rome, and by the early church fathers up to the 5th, 6th century CE. But it starts with a current conception of what we regard as human beings having a sexuality. So human beings have a sexuality. And the history of sexuality is not the history of that conception, but it's rather the history of what was in place before that very conception was formed. So in many ways, Foucault's history of sexuality, apart from talking about sexuality in volume 1, doesn't really mention it again when he discusses classical Greece, imperial Rome, and the church fathers. In fact, so the history of sexuality is the history of what was in place before sexuality came on the scene, and what was in place in order for sexuality to come on the scene. All right. I mentioned this already, this kind of impact in analytical political philosophy and this interest in genealogy through Nietzsche and Foucault. All right, so now Wittgenstein. I'm going to treat Wittgenstein as by proxy. So I'm going to take one of the foremost authorities on Wittgenstein, Peter Hacker, who is now retired, but used to be at St. John's College in Oxford. And he's written expansive volumes on an exegesis on the philosophical investigations, but has also written work that is Wittgensteinian in character, and some of which I will be looking at. So what is Wittgenstein's project? And I think it bears stressing that the project of Wittgenstein and the project of Foucault are completely different. So I'm not saying here that we should think of either as doing what the other was doing. Now, Wittgenstein's project, and what's interesting about the project is that it doesn't have a very strong historical dimension to it. And there's a reason why it doesn't have that historical dimension. But Wittgenstein's project, at least in my interpretation of it, is of philosophy as an assembling of grammatical reminders, as a way of sketching the logic of our concepts in order to respond to philosophical puzzlement, which forgets the subtleties or disregards or runs roughshod over the subtleties of our grammar. That's the project. And in many ways, it's motivated by philosophical problems. So in a way, it's the philosophical problem, it's the philosophical tangle, the confusion that is driving everything that happens afterward. Now, there's a good reason perhaps why there isn't a role for history there, but I'll get to that. All right, so Hacker, as I said, is somebody who's done work in that tradition. And he dubs what he's doing in the last sort of 15 years or so as a form of connective analysis, or showing connections between our concepts, or showing how various forms of expression are interconnected or express similar or different concepts as a means of clarifying the fundamental structures of how we think or of how we understand the world. And of course, all that can be dignified with the label of metaphysics, or maybe damned with the label of metaphysics, but it's a rather innocuous form of metaphysics, the so-called descriptive metaphysics. Another way he's dubbed his work is as philosophical anthropology, and this is the kind of project which invokes Kant and is another possible way of thinking of a connection between Wittgenstein and Foucault, but I won't go there. But in the recent 15 years, Hacker has produced this 4-volume connective analysis of different types of concepts. So the first volume is called The Human Nature, the Categorical Framework, and that discusses those very fundamental basic ideas of substance, of agent, of cause, of action, of reasons. Then he moves on to the intellectual powers, where he discusses cogitative and cognitive powers, such as thought, imagination, belief, knowledge, and so on. Then in the passions, he discusses the emotions. And in many interesting ways, we'll see that he distinguishes shame and envy or fear from love, which he thinks has a history in a way that the other emotions don't have, and ends that 4-volume investigation with the so-called moral powers. Now, one of the aspects then, or one of the interesting features of Wittgensteinian conceptual analysis, grammatical analysis, is that it retains a sense of context, it retains a sense of connection between actions. So we see our concept by looking at particular things we might say, or particular inferences we might make, or particular predicates we might ascribe to a particular expression, and so on and so forth. And there is no role in that for telling a story about how our uses came to be the way they are. Because in many ways, the way we use our expressions determine the kind of concepts that we use, and that's all we need to know, more or less. So in a way, there is a room for connective analysis, or there isn't a room for historical investigation in this sense. And of course, you could say, to appeal to all that, to appeal to something in the past, would be a form of the genetic fallacy. So, but we'll see nevertheless that there is a role for history. So that's part of the things to discuss. All right, now there's a number of scholars who have tried to sort of bring the two together in some ways. So one story one can tell of indirect historical influence is to say that Pierre Hadot was one of those who introduced Wittgenstein to France, and he did work on Stoicism and sort of the exercises, spiritual exercises in Stoicism, and Foucault's work on techniques of the self is a kind of a continuation of that. So that's an indirect influence of Wittgenstein on Foucault. I'm not concerned with that, but I thought I'd mention it just in case. Now, in the 2000s, David Owen had three publications here, which are more or less riffing on the same topics. And the idea is that Foucault stands for this kind of genealogical analysis. And what makes it Wittgensteinian in a way is that it's a kind of an antidote to being locked in a particular sense of what's possible, or a particular picture as a system of judgments, as I put it here. So Wittgenstein talks about the picture that held us captive, and in many ways he has in mind this kind of sense of a way of speaking that we can't get away from, we think must be the way in which all our concepts will respond to. And David Owen sort of sees that as a kind of a common link. So he says, well, it's this being held captive by a picture that is more or less the same as the liberatory or whatever result that we get from genealogical investigation, i.e. being able to appreciate different forms of organizing our social lives, any aspect of that. So genealogy is a form of assembling an overview of how things came to be the way they are, similar to how Wittgenstein would assemble an overview of our grammar through examples. And that, in a way, is a kind of a struggle against dogmatism, against the conception that things must be thus and so, there's no alternative. Okay, so that's the line David Owen takes. Another line, more interesting here, is the line of Arnold Davidson, who I think is now retired, but he was at the University of Chicago. Now, Arnold Davidson is sort of very much repeating the investigation that Foucault had on sexuality, or supplementing that, and making a couple of points in the process that he dubs as Wittgensteinian. So here we can see a bit better how Davidson thinks the two are related. So first of all, he discusses this investigation into the emergence of sexuality as a case of historical epistemology. And he says that what comes with this new term that is linked to all sorts of understandings of biology, of psychology, and so on, is a new form of experience too. So the structures of knowledge come together with a new form of experience and with a new type of grammar, of course. Human beings have a sexuality that is of that kind. They're aware of that. They discover that. They exercise that. These are the grammatical relations that come together with a concept. And he uses the notion of style of reasoning after hacking, I guess. So one of the important bits here is that there's an emphasis on concepts being obviously not the same as words. So the notion of sexuality by itself doesn't carry the same concept. Here's an example from 1888. There's a handbook of medical science, and in that handbook is asserted that a man has sex, a spermatozoon has sexuality. And then Davidson sort of wonders and says, well, can we apply the predicates that we apply to our understanding of people as having a sexuality? Can a spermatozoon be heterosexual and so on? Can it suffer from deviance? Can it have abnormally increased or decreased sexuality, which are the kind of questions that it's appropriate, grammatically appropriate to ask about human beings? And he says it's a neither no nor yes, because the question only makes sense within a particular psychiatric style of reasoning, and that doesn't apply to spermatozoa. It applies to people. So we don't understand, what it is to have a sexuality outside of that. Okay, so then he continues, the grammar and the conceptual connections to other concepts, he says, constitutes an object within that style of reasoning, and he says sexuality is this kind of Wittgensteinian object. And no one, he continues to emphasize this kind of impossibility. I'm not sure I agree with this way of putting it, but anyway, no one could know the grammatical criteria of this object before the emergence of this style of reasoning, which is to say that before this time there was as yet no such thing as sexuality in the way we understand it. So already we're seeing this kind of sense of our concepts having a kind of a historical conditions of possibility and possibly also a history. Here's another example from the same book, the notion of perversion. And again, the notion of perversion is not the word perversion, or the concept of perversion is not the word perversion. And through this kind of shift, which again is holistic, again involves a number of practices and a number of understandings of human biology, we get the application of the notion of perversion to a number of things that are thus grouped together, things such as masochism, sadism, fetishism, and so on. And the idea is that, well, Davidson's idea is that, look, St. Augustine spoke about perversion, but the role of that particular word in that system of understanding and those practices gave it a very different, or made it express a very different concept, which has nothing to do with our concept of perversion. So then Davidson sort of concludes, a careful analysis shows that it doesn't share the same conceptual space, and indeed the same word hides two radically different concepts. And we shall not understand the concept unless we examine and see what other statements it can allow and disallow, or what kind of inferences it can support, and what other concepts it can be related to. So it's no mere surface phenomenon. It's not an epiphenomenal inconvenience that these statements that go together with that diverge so markedly. In effect, we're dealing with different concepts. So one of the upshots of that is that in terms of comparisons, then, the idea is that we must compare not words or isolated forms or formulas, but rather whole conceptual structures. And those conceptual structures, as I said, involve not just relations between concepts, but actually relations between practices, and have a very strongly embedded character in the social life. All right, let's move on. After Davidson, there's this article by Colin Koopman, who talks about studying the history of practices after Foucault and Wittgenstein. And Koopman, in many ways, doesn't talk about Foucault and Wittgenstein, but he talks about Brandom as a Wittgensteinian and Davidson as a Foucauldian. So I thought I'd partly follow some of his strategy. And he sort of says, look, the kind of different rationalities that Foucault discusses as being implemented in different historical points in time are a factor of, or are a matter of, multiplicity of different conceptual networks. And I think the main point that Koopman makes, and is worth taking away, is that really there is, once the emphasis on concepts and their internal relationships to our practices is emphasized, once this is in place, then there is no role in history for mere behavior. So in a way, what Koopman is sort of saying is that to study the history of practices is to study the history of concepts. Practices are constituted by conceptuality, which he discusses in these two features, but we don't really, we shouldn't be concerned about that now. All right. So a final figure I wish to mention is Mark Beaver, who is let's say a political sort of theorist, but also a kind of a philosopher of history at the same time. So he's got a couple of books that start in the last sort of 25 years or so, that start from this kind of concern with Wittgenstein and end with a concern on Foucault. And that's a kind of a broad trajectory in which you can locate the two. But in any case, the points I wish to take from Beaver is a kind of an emphasis again on concepts, through this emphasis on what he calls hermeneutic meanings. And hermeneutic he understands as being related to what speakers do with particular expressions. And he draws a sharp distinction between hermeneutic meanings and sort of semantic or truth conditional or decontextualized meanings. And his sort of whole spiel is that we should, that really what thinkers such as Wittgenstein sort of recommend is actually looking at hermeneutic meanings. But never mind, the point that Beaver is sort of reiterating is, again, that this is a holistic understanding of concepts. So he sort of situates himself in a kind of Aquinian tradition, so webs of belief, webs of concepts, and sort of he discusses, for example, a kind of a diachronic explanation as to what happens when there's a dilemma, what he calls a dilemma, or a new type of belief, and that sort of disturbs or commands various readjustments that take place around our web of belief, and so on. Okay, so let's see a couple of other things that Beaver sort of says. He has a kind of a response article to that book. He says, logic here, as in the logic of the history of ideas, stands as a subject of Wittgenstein's notion of philosophy as a matter of the grammar of our concepts, and it studies the forms of reasoning appropriate to a discipline. So in a way, what he's trying to say here is that he's interested in spelling out the form of reasoning appropriate to the history of ideas, but also making a strong point that I guess Collingwood made very forcefully when he said all history is the history of ideas. And I'll reiterate that all history is the history of concepts. So the historical study of actions and also practices institutions, Beaver says, always involves the history of ideas, and so on. So Beaver in his later work discusses genealogy and Foucault, and I guess you can see, if one were to look more carefully at his work than I have, to see some of the ways in which he thinks the two are interlinked. Now, let me get back then to this notion of holism. And of course, whenever holism is mentioned, I guess a natural thought is to think of these kind of idealist systems that are, to use sort of Hegel's notion, expressive totalities, so that every aspect of that system sort of reiterates the principle of its organization or whatever. So what we end up, if we go down the route of holism, sometimes it is thought, is to have this kind of incommensurable systems view, so that, well, how do you bring two very different systems into contact? And that's a kind of a and I remember, for example, reading Stephen Toulmin's 1972 book on human understanding, where he sort of says Collingwood has this kind of, is one of those who belong to the cult of systematicity. So once you assert this kind of holistic system, then you can't really compare, and so on. But I think that doesn't quite follow. And in many ways, getting away from that doesn't quite justify thinking of concepts as detachable items from practices that we can sort of assert through expanses of time without any regard for anything. So a kind of a moderate holism, I guess, is necessary to fend off that problem, but without necessarily taking this as an absolute systematic enclosure. Right. So just a couple of references here. Yes. So Beaver mentions Quine, and he mentions Wittgenstein, and he also says, look, instead of trying to decompose concepts into their constituents, and we'll see how that is a strategy, really, not just for those that are charged with doing that by Beaver, but also by people like Foucault himself and Nietzsche. So although I'm bringing in Foucault here, I am quite critical of some of the things that he does from that conceptual point of view. I think he doesn't quite have as strong a handle on, what is a concept as Wittgenstein does. Okay, so and another question, quotation from Pierre-Olivier Métaux, who talks about Canguilhem, and there we see that it's not just about connections between concepts. It's not just that, oh, we have a system of disembodied concepts that are related to each other. No, we have concepts that are embedded in practical situations. People do things with them, and there are sorts of inferential relationships and all sorts of grammatical relationships that are as part of that practice. And here's the way, for example, or one of the ways that Foucault also cashes out this idea in his second volume of the History of Sexuality, where he sort of says, look, there are common ethical codes between, from classical Greece to imperial Rome to the Christian church fathers. We don't need to take him at his word, but let's suppose that there are. I mean, I wouldn't know to disprove or verify that. But let's say there are common ethical maxims. Don't sleep with another man's wife, for example. Foucault's point is that these ethical codes are not self-standing, but rather through ethical practice, they amount to different conceptual practices, to use a bit of an awkward phrase. So yes, he does have this kind of sense of going along the cult of systematicity here, where he talks about particular notions having a value within a particular system. But then he sort of says, well, no, it matters the way in which these are implemented. And of course, this is quite close to what Wittgenstein is doing in relation to spelling out how rule and application are related. For want of a better explanation, the whole notion of a rule and its application is that the relationship is internal, that the rule isn't the rule formulation, it's the applied rule formulation. So it's the understood rule formulation. So in a similar way, what Foucault is saying is that, look, okay, yes, the formulation of the code might look similar, but once you pair it with the practice, ascesi is the word he uses, then you have a sense of what exactly it's doing, which isn't misleading and is in some sense to be specified, historically accurate. So let me lighten up a little bit and maybe just reduce the number of quotations that I've managed to put on these slides and think a little bit about this question. So what is the history of a concept a history of? And I've already sort of said that a concept is just another way of referring to how we use expressions. Is another way of saying that because we use expressions in these ways, that's what we mean. So one way of thinking about a concept is an abstraction from the use of expressions. Now, if a concept is an abstraction from the use of expressions, or if it really reduces, not in a kind of a maybe reduces is the right word, but if it really amounts to the rules for our use of expressions, then in what sense exactly does it have a history? And let's first reflect a little bit on Quentin Skinner, who's an intellectual sort of historian at Cambridge, has written a lot of stuff on the history of political thought, who distinguishes between the history of statements and the history of sentences. I think that the distinction is sort of equivalent. So he thinks the history of statements would be an absurdly ambitious enterprise. But at the very least, he thinks that the history of statements, or what I would say the history of concepts, would at least be conceptually proper, whereas the sentence itself, apart from the statements which people make with it, is simply, he says, not a proper object of study, certainly not for the historian. So again, I'm not trying to make a claim that it's only Wittgenstein or only Foucault who are grappling with these problems. In fact, since the mid-20th century, probably even before than that, because there's a whole of discussion in Max Weber, and there's a discussion in Austrian economics about the role of these concepts, and there's offshoots of Austrian economics that go down the sort of von Mises line, who talks about praxeology as a kind of a logic of our choice and so on. But these are there's a broad range of debates centered around these topics that are in many ways difficult to get right, difficult to handle. Okay, so if that's the case, then the idea that our concepts change is more like the idea that our standards change, rather than the idea that our friends change, where you could say our friends change, but they're still our friends, and they're in many ways they retain many of their features. So if our concepts change, much like our standards changing, there's a much more of a radical change, and much less of much more care required in order to specify the relationships between our earlier standards and our current standards. Okay, so I've already said this kind of moderate holism idea then implies that concepts are somewhat sensitive to transportation. Why? Because the rules for our use of expressions are not stable. It's an open question which rules for our use of expressions are stable. And of course, there are all sorts of processes taking place here. One process is the organized study of the history of philosophy. And that is in many ways responsible for both investigating variations, but also preserving a sense of continuity. And that's the case for a number of traditions that we might call living history or living traditions. But I'll have more to say about this just in a moment. But modern holism implies then that concepts are sensitive to transportation, that we can't really, if we're interested in what human beings do, if we're interested, as by definition, sociologists and historians and philosophers are, then it pays to be extra careful about the kind of conceptual questions that underpin that interest. All right, one way of thinking about this, obviously, and it's quite a well-known one, is to look at what happens when you go back in time. So arguably, for example, our concept of science, in the way, and notice I said our concept of science, signaling that the current understanding of science we have now has a particular grammar of science that relies on science being understood as a kind of a honorific, on notions of being methodical or systematic, of relations to knowledge, of relations to rigor, and so on and so forth. That these kind of relationships, you could say, are constitutive of the concept. And in many ways, we understand science to be a very socially organized and practice enshrined in higher education institutions. Now, if we're interested then in writing the history of science, it stands to reason that the further back we go, we're dealing with a problem of the disappearing what? Because that conception of science that we committed ourselves to writing a history of is not applicable the further back in time we go. So in that sense, if we decide that what we're interested in is writing the history of a particular concept, then to talk about a span of time as being as falling under that concept, or a concept being applicable under a span of time, certain conditions need to be met. Which is why there is a very strong tendency to want to decompose stuff and retain the sense of history. I'm going to use two words here, descent and formation, that are used by Nietzsche and that Foucault takes up. So the notion of descent is of a descent of the kind of other things that our current practice or current concept has descended from. And the notion of formation is equally the way in which it came to be. But of course, before it came to be, before it was formed, it didn't exist like that. So one way you could see genealogy is as a way of getting around this kind of disappearing what problem, by giving a very specific sense to the notion of a history of, namely the notion of a history of as in the other things that took place from which it descended, or the other things that took place and which were somehow fused together and formed what we now have. But what we now have wasn't really part of that history quite yet. All right, now I'll reiterate again that all history is the history of concepts, and that when we're talking about concepts, we're not talking about disembodied things, we're talking about what people do. So concepts and practices and forms of understanding are really more or less the same thing. Now you'll say, very recently, there's been all sorts of people writing histories of objects. The history of the pregnancy test, the history of the world in 100 objects, the history of the pineapple, the history of you name it. It's a very common mode of writing history books, and one of the reasons perhaps it's so common is because it's very capacious. So it allows a number of things to be included under the so-called object. So let me just deliver on the promised relaxation that I promised 15 minutes ago, and just give you a sense of a possible sort of variation here. So, all right, so somebody could say, what about, the history of objects? What about the history of the tank? The tank surely is an object, and we have particular criteria for when an object is an object, and so on and so forth. I've got here three photographs from some of the ways in which the tank came to be associated with the suppression of uprisings by authoritarian regimes. And in many ways, there would be no problem, of course, to include that kind of history in the history of the tank. But the point I want to make is that even a so-called history of objects isn't really a history of objects in any sense of deconceptualized objects. In many ways, a history of something understood in a particular way, sets forth a particular range of criteria as to what counts as delivering that history. So, of course, the history of the Mark I, or the prototype for the Mark I that was sort of used in World War I by Britain, would be a very different history than the history of the armored vehicle, or the history of the use of tanks in urban environments to suppress just rebellion. So, first of all, we have to decide when we talk about, for example, the history of the tank, what kind of conception of the tank do we have? Is it the history of this tank, or this physical object, or this prototype? The history of a piece of technology? When was the continuous track that it uses to propel itself? That's a piece of technology that pre-existed the tank, for example. Or the idea of the armored vehicle, or the idea of having a particular thing in battle that enables troops to, progress behind it, or whatever. And that idea, one could say, goes back to the 15th century. But all I'm trying to say here is that, of course, a historian writing a book about the history of the tank can write about all those things. And I'm not trying to say that you shouldn't write about every and all of them. But rather, the point I'm trying to make is that what's understood by the tank here is logically distinct, and the kind of explanatory questions that can be asked about, a particular use of the tank, or a particular piece of metal, or a particular physical object, or a particular piece of technology, or what have you, are very different, and thus are logically distinct. Here's another example from former historian turned celebrity Yuval Noah Harari and his book Homo Deus, where he talks about the lawn, and the lawn, and you think the lawn is again invites this kind of a sense of an historical object that is, didn't we always have lawns? A lawn is a blade of grass, blades of grass put together, and of course, he's quite good at showing why that's not the case, and that the lawn is not a blade of grass. It's not just some weeds or a particular plant, but it's rather a very specific idea, and that specific idea is intertwined with practices, with understandings, with other concepts. In many ways, the picture of middle-class suburbia having a front yard, or a very well taken care of lawn, is part of, or can be part of, the constitution of what the historical object is. So he says, and it's also instructive what he says here, he presents the history of the lawn as a way of answering the question of, should I have a lawn outside my house? And using history to loosen sort of the grip of the past, once you know that it was the whatever the French monarch who had outside the palace, or that once you know that, you'll have a different sense of what the lawn is, which is both true and false. But in any case, what I'm trying to point out here is that the idea of the lawn as an historical object isn't the idea of a blade of grass. It's the idea of, as Harari, for example, very nicely points out, nurturing a lawn at the entrance to private residences and public buildings as a sign of respectability. That's what the history of the lawn is a shorthand for. And therefore, that means that a history of the lawn is a history of that idea, those understandings, those sets of practices. And note how strongly tied these things are to all sorts of public institutions, or the difference between public and private institutions, or the difference to having a front or reception area, or architectural choices, or whatever. So really, it's quite strongly tied to a number of things. And it's the mark of superficiality to say, well, didn't the ancients have lawns? Of course they did. Well, no, they didn't, if the lawn is all that. All right. I realize I'm nearing to the end of the hour. So if you don't mind, I'll spend another 5 minutes. I'll take up another 5 minutes if that's okay. Georg, is that?
Yes, of course. It's totally up to you.
I'll try to finish. Yeah, I put too many slides. But what the point I want to make here is that precisely because of this difficulty, it's very tempting to want to decompose that into things that perhaps are not self-standing in the same way. So here's Nietzsche in the Genealogy of Morals, or Morality, depending on the translation, where he talks about punishment. He says, look, punishment, there's two elements in punishment, a variable element and then a fixed kind of element. So punishment as a kind of a set of bodily procedures, as it were, as a strict sequence of procedures, he says, and then a kind of a fluid meaning of it, or a purpose or an expectation. And he says, look, the procedure will be older than that, and so on. And in many ways, this is exactly the kind of illegitimate, in many ways, abstraction that I've been trying to point out. The idea that somehow you can have punishment without having a particular purpose, that it constitutes punishment without punishing somebody for what they did. Well, if you want to talk about mere hitting, or accidentally, what's the difference between punishment, mere hitting, accidentally bumping onto someone? It isn't because they're different procedures, as it were. All right, but this gives us also a kind of a grip on the idea that some concepts are more historical than others. And given what I've said, I think it's also a kind of an interesting thing to think about. Why is it that certain concepts are more historical than others? Raymond Goyce, who is a sort of political philosopher, talks about the historicality of concepts, and he says particular concepts such as Christianity, democracy, he includes punishment after Nietzsche too, and I guess the reason he identifies why they are historical is because they're deeply entrenched in our world and give it structure. I guess the number of their connections, the number and ways in which they figure in what we do. Think about childhood and all the kind of legal repercussions that it has, educational, dietary. It really is very, very strongly tied to all sorts of things, what it means to be a child. Okay, now I want to say something about Hacker, who I haven't mentioned so far. And remember, Hacker's 4 volumes are meant to deal with these very fundamental concepts that structure how we think about the world, let's put it like that. So in the first one, he talks about reasons and agents and substances and things that act and so on. And then he talks about emotions such as fear and shame and envy and love. And when he comes to love, he sort of says, look, love is different than the other emotions. Love is not like fear, where you can fear, a mammoth trying, or a pack of mammoths sort of running over you, or you can fear Caesar's sort of crossing of the Rubicon or whatever, or you can fear, that doesn't change the grammar of fear, he says. But with love, it's different. So in the book that is meant to be an exemplar of, and it is an exemplar of connective analysis, he does indulge in some historical accounts. And when it comes to love, he traces strands of our conception and concept of love through Jerusalem, Platonic understandings, Roman views, romantic understandings, before Romanticism of the troubadour, medieval troubadours, and so on. And in many ways, the question he's asking about love is one, or the point he's making about love is that there, the notion of a concept and of its conceptions is much less strongly distinguishable. So he sort of says, unlike the other human emotions, such as fear or anger, love has a long and convoluted history. And in fact, the different forms of love that are possible in different societies or times are a fact that doesn't quite hold for fear or anger, not because there are the same things to fear or the same things to be angry about, but rather because those things that we fear or are angry about don't change as significantly the emotion or the grammar of the emotion of fear or anger, but they do change significantly the grammar of the emotion of love. And also, what matters, of course, are the various views or doctrines or conceptions that people have about love. And that is, his point is that much less clearly distinguished from the concept. Okay, so, but of course, there are different questions here, and one has to keep that in mind, that there's a question of understanding our concept of love. And we can talk about how we love our families, or how we love our children, or how we love being alone with our books, or how we love our partners, or how we're in love with this person or that person, or how we whatever. We can catalog the ways in which that concept or those different expressions and the different concepts that might be invoked play in our lives, and that's fine. But of course, there's another question we can ask, which is, well, why do we have these concepts of love? Why these particular ones? And there, I think it's much more clearly an historical question. And that, as I've already intimated, depends on the idea that these criterial features of many of our concepts are variable with love and are much less variable with other concepts. And I think the point Heiko is sort of making here is a kind of a version of this kind of weak holism that I've been pointing out, because what he is saying is not that all our concepts change all the time, but rather that there are obviously some things in which our practices and those of our ancestors are quite common, and that we might find easy ways, for example, to translate texts about what the ancients did that correspond very strongly to what we do now. And of course, that's not excluded at all. In fact, it might be quite common. But of course, there are other concepts and other questions we can ask about them where this is much less so. So let me also show you what he says here about how the different objects of love constitute different concepts of love. So loving God, for example, has very different criteria of what it is to love God. Obedience, for one. There is also different forms of that love. In the Orthodox tradition, and probably in other ones, there's this notion of eros in relation to God, rather than just agape. Criteria are different, and what he's doing here is sort of saying, look, the love of the eromenos, or the good-looking youth in ancient Greece, isn't quite the same love, but with a different object substituted for that. The loyalty of love of a squire for his knight, of a soldier, and so on, are not just like erotic love. And Hacker is also giving us a kind of a sense of those grammar constituting features. So the criteria for its description, when would we say that we're actually, that somebody, what kind of behavior counts as criteria for somebody loving God or being in love with a good-looking youth or whatever? So right, I'll try and end here. I have a number of very many other slides which I won't go over. I think I overdid it a bit, but I want to, in partial conclusion, I want to say this, that this notion of, or conceptual sensitivity, or sensitivity to our concepts and their criteria of identity, which is in many ways the same thing as being very careful to describe accurately both what topics of investigation are, but also what kind of practices people in a particular point in time are engaging. So avoiding the cardinal sin of anachronism goes through exactly this type of conceptual sensitivity. And this is a matter for philosophy. It's also a matter for history. It's also a matter for the social sciences. So it's a common ground there. And it's no, if I may just make a slightly divergent remark. In the past I've worked a lot on Peter Winch, and Peter Winch's book, or The Idea of a Social Science in its relation to philosophy, is really a case of seeing that common area of overlap, because Winch is writing or his thought is informed by Wittgenstein, it's informed by Weber, it's informed by Collingwood and Oakeshott, and there's a common ground there that shows the depth of the issues. Okay, so all history, the history of concepts, or all the doing of history presupposes this sensitivity to concepts. That's easier said than put to practice, obviously. And again, the notion, obviously, after Wittgenstein, the notion of a concept is really to be referred to particular uses, particular practices. And that connection is really what makes it non-detachable, to use a phrase that Mink and Paul Roth have been using recently, but with regard to narratives. But so this is a slightly different point. But I wouldn't claim that there's a non-detachability from narratives, but there's non-detachability of content from particular practices. Okay, so, and we've seen that there's a temptation to decompose stuff, to say, well, punishment isn't punishment, but it's a set of procedures without any explicit connections, just the procedures. And Foucault does that too when he talks about the confession. He says, people confess their sins, and they confess their crimes, and they confess their thoughts. And the confession that was initially a religious practice became spread to everywhere in society. And that's also taking a very non-careful view of what the confession actually is. I had a final slide. I'll just mention it and I'll stop, of a discussion in the history of science, of how the history of science can work together with the history of philologies, by Lorraine Daston. Lorraine Daston and Glenn Most, and they were saying, well, let's look at the history of practices, and if we look at the history of practices, we'll realize that humanists and physicists are doing the same things. So they're taking notes, and they're doing, and you think, well, okay, but A, what are the criteria for identifying same practices, and B, how is that responsive to a set research aim of investigating the history of science under a particular understanding of science as having some kind of distinctiveness? All right, I'll stop here, and thank you very much for your kind attention.
Right, thank you, Leonidas. Okay, now it's question, comments, criticism time. Maybe you could unshare your presentation. It's easier to see if people have questions or something. Yes, so please step forward if you have any comments or questions. Or maybe, Jonimat, you said you have to leave soon. Do you want to go first?
Yeah, I may need to go soon. So maybe, yes, I start.
Yes, if you have something to say.
Oh, yeah, say hi, yes. Yeah, it's getting dark here. Thanks very much for the very brilliant talk and a very rich history of, what is it? History of concept or something. I guess I just have a kind of a simple question, which is also, I think, might be a difficult one to answer. Going back to the basics, very basics. You went through various traditions. I said various things about what concepts are, what things are in the history, but you moved on always to something else. So I would ask you to restate, in the end, in your mind, what concepts are, and because I think regarding the history of concepts, there are, how I would see it, two really fundamental issues. One is sort of what are they? Kind of ontological question. Of course, you would take them as a formal entities. And then the other kind of to do with the criteria of change and how much change is allowed in order to this concept or entity to be the same, or when it changes to something else, or it's being replaced by another kind of notion. And to what I have been thinking, I think you said very interesting things, and yeah, kind of, I would have wanted you to stop somewhere, but in the end, I wasn't clear how do you regard concepts other than something holistic. So is it possible to say briefly how would you go about it?
Yes, thank you for that. Well, I would, in the name of being somewhat faithful to some of the intellectual sort of sources that I've mentioned here, I would avoid the kind of straight taking, pardon me, I would avoid taking at face value the metaphysical question of what are concepts in that way. So I would respond to that question by saying, well, what is the concept of science? Well, look at particular uses that we make of the word science, and distinguish between the way in which it's used in logically equivalent ways or logically divergent ways. So when we talk about the science of whatever, the science of religion, or the science of, you could say that that's an illegitimate use, but there are obviously there's obviously a range of things that can count as concept constitutive. So and not all concepts are equally well defined, obviously, but the fact that you can have a scientific organization of something, the fact that you can apply predicates to science that are, science is systematic, it's orderly, science is not blue, it's not white, it's not, the fact that there is particular logical relationships that are allowed and not, or not, in how we use. Well, so the rules for these logical relationships constitute the concept of science. So in that way, the relation to practices is embedded in that answer. Maybe holism is a bad word, because it might tend to suggest that somehow there's different concepts that are related to each other in this kind of web or whatever. So I don't like that kind of web of beliefs imagery, for example. All I mean to say is that, first of all, that for particular concepts to make sense, there are relations to social practices. I had a particular slide that I didn't mention, but so the first thing is that there are these concept constituting rules. about what it makes sense to say about science, or what it makes sense to say about age, or what it makes sense to say about anything, really. But the other thing, of course, is that these things have a use, or they don't have a use. So we have a use. We have a concept of the oldest person in the world, and the oldest person in the world was the person that was born, the longer time ago, or whatever. But why don't we have a concept of the youngest person in the world? What is the youngest person in the world? It's not because. So what I'm trying to say is that you could define the youngest person in the world as the person born most recently. But of course, there's all sorts of conditions around that. For example, the fact that the world population is not 1,000. So you have hundreds and thousands of children born every day. So who could keep track? What would a leaderboard, do if it were constantly changing? What sort of point would there be to talking about that if we didn't have all sorts of things around that, such as awarding sort of blue zones of people who live longest, and inquiring into their diet to see why they've lived the longest? All these things are around the notion of the oldest person in the world. But we have nothing like that, nothing like the conditions around the youngest person in the world. So I think what I want to say is that it's not like you can transport the young. It's not that you can have the youngest person. But there is this science fiction film called Children of Men, which begins in 2005, I think, and begins with this idea that somebody killed the youngest person in the world, because it's a dystopian society. But that's a very specific concept that you can't really transport, and it isn't usable, isn't really, So in relation to the first question, how would I respond to what concepts are? Well, by giving examples and even giving examples of the formal concept, because concept is a kind of a way of referring to a type of thing. So giving examples and talking about uses. I don't know whether I've responded to the second question, which I may have forgotten. So please remind me if I haven't.
It had to do with criteria of change, how much change is allowed in order to concept to be the same.
Sorry.
I need to go in 5 minutes. So I like how you replied, and very briefly, would you not be happy to, because you talk about uses, and there are uses, even the youngest person in the world we can use. It's an expression we can use. So, and at some point, I think it's in relation to Anderson, you said concept could be an abstraction of the use of an expression. That would give a nice definition. So would you
Hacker says that, and I'm happy to go along, but I think it's not quite sufficient unless there is a particular way of spelling that commitment out through the examples and so on. And as to the youngest person in the world having a use, well, it has a use in the sense, you can use it in the sense that you can utter it, but it has no point. It has no point because all the background conditions aren't there for it to have a point for us. Whereas, and then I think that's a good way of responding to the similarity, because, what if gradually the world population would shrink and, giving birth to children was even more difficult? There isn't a point at which it would certainly be, there isn't a line that we would cross and say, now the concept is relevant or has a point to it. And now it doesn't have a point to it. But of course, it most certainly doesn't have a point. It doesn't have a use for our current historical time and societies, some of them, or most of them. So I think that's the answer to how do you know it's similar or not? Well, you have to look at not just a particular form of words, but how it fits into a whole host of relevant institutions. And as always, I think here the overarching thing is the kind of question you're asking, which is also, and I tried to make this point rather forcefully, which also sets various criteria as to what can be relevant. And I made that point with reference to the history of the tag. What is it a history of exactly? I hope that answers
Yeah,
at least in
thank you.
part.
I'm happy with that. Thanks.
Great, thank you. Thank you both of you. Okay, then I think I just saw Josepina Dora raised her hand. I hope I didn't overlook anybody else. No, please, Josie. But you're still mute.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Right. Sorry. So I was thinking. So thank you very much for the paper. And I do agree with you. I was wondering, what you were saying. I think at some point you said, echoing Collingwood, that all history is the history of concepts. And I wonder whether, you would say that, that applies to a certain kind of humanistic history, but it does not apply, for example, to, I don't know, to evolutionary history. So that if you're writing, the history of the evolution of a species in a way, you wouldn't need to, you are not, because dinosaurs don't, I don't know, they don't have an understanding of themselves. They're not interpreting and self-interpreting beings, that in a sense, their history is not a conceptual history. It's a history of a different kind. So I just wondered whether you would say that applied to a humanistic history, or whether you'd think that, that, of course, you can give a history of science where you look at the ways in which scientific concepts operated, but then I suppose that is different from saying what the evolutionary biologist is doing, because they're not in the practice, they're not providing, I suppose, they're not referring to the ways in which the dinosaurs thought of themselves, for example. They're just looking at the evolutions of the species and so on. So I just wondered whether you think that there are histories which are not histories of concepts.
Thanks, Josie, for that. I think the way in which this sort of aphorism is formulated, even by Collingwood, is to have a kind of a definition of history as the history of human action, of res gestae, or whatever. I offered it in a similar kind of spirit. Now, I'm not sure. I'm not sure that evolutionary biology neatly falls into a non-conceptual history as long as it's concerned with human beings. I think that's one of the problems, perhaps, when and I don't want to seem overconfident here because I don't know very much about evolutionary biology, but so long as it applies to animals or non-human animals, obviously, I think the whole issue comes down to this. It comes down to the illegitimate character of discounting a form of understanding of the people who lived in a historical period, because that's really what we're looking at, or what sociologists and historians are most of the time looking at. I don't want to be all of the time, but most of the time, even when it's not explicitly acknowledged, I think the overarching question that is guiding the investigation involves that aspect. So it involves the aspect of what is the form of understanding, or that form of self-understanding of the people in a particular place and time. So in that sense, it's built into the very object of inquiry because of the question we're asking. So I think in the case of evolutionary biology, and I don't know much about evolutionary biology, but I think one of the problems there would be to insist on evolutionary sort of concepts to the exclusion or to the distortion of particular forms of historical understanding, and to, even though obviously the timescales probably are very different, but I would see that as an area of possible confusions and needing to untangle things, rather than as proving that we can safely discount the form of understanding of people at a particular point in time and still learn something about them. Because I mean, that's the nature of the contradiction, is that we want to know something about them, but if we do want to know something about them, then that's tantamount to saying that we want to know something about their form of understanding. I think economists have a nice way of talking about these kind of statements that are equivalent, logically equivalent, but are not obviously so. And sometimes they call them these sort of accounting statements, because you can look at it from both ways, both from the supply side and the demand side and whatever. So I think the idea is that if you actually spell out what's involved in the kind of questions that historians and others ask, then I think it follows that that's what you want to know about. You want to know about the forms of understanding. You don't want to know about something which is to the exclusion of all that. I hope that answers somewhat.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it's just that, and Collingwood uses the term history in that, in a very specific sense. But I don't think that he would have necessarily, he wouldn't have wanted to say that there is no such thing as a history that abstracts from self-understanding, but he would have said that is a different kind of history, perhaps, that is not what we normally call history, or is not a history of the res gesta, because it addresses different questions. I mean, I was thinking, perhaps Bernard Williams sometimes, says that, the history of science is different from the history of I suppose, of humanistic inquiries, because it's vindicatory, whereas humanistic history is not like that. So I suppose I'm saying that maybe that here there are different conceptions of the past. We're asking different questions, as you say, about this, about the past. And if we are asking humanistic questions about the past, then we cannot possibly abstract from the self-understanding of the agents and their practices. But maybe in some cases it is legitimate to do that. And it doesn't entail saying that humanistic history is wrong. It's just that then you're asking and answering a different kind of question, that and so you go about answering it in a different way.
Yes, and I would add, most of the time we're not really asking a different question. It's just that we're confused about what we're asking.
All right, thank you. I would have a question, but I let other people go first since I'm the moderator, if they would have. Well, I don't see anything at the moment, so let me ask my question and then we'll return if somebody else has a question. So I think Yoni-Matti asked about the history of concepts, and I'm interested in give me your theories and background. What would the historiography of concepts look like? Give me your framework. So if I understood correctly, and please correct me on this if I'm wrong, sort of Wittgenstein gives you something like the logic or the philosophy of concepts, what are concepts and the abstractions from use and meaning and whatever. And Foucault gives something like maybe the methodology of how we then do the historiography of concepts, because it is genealogy, but I'm not exactly sure that I know what it is. And then you mentioned with Foucault, you mentioned Herkunft and Entstehung, which is to say there's descent and formation, which can be particularly, I guess, targeted or understood, I guess, as opposed to other historiographic approaches or methodologies. But my question still is, in this methodology and this genealogy, there must be some sort of justification, or there must be some sort of a way by which we assess whether or not we can assert something about concepts, whether we can infer a certain use and so on. Does genealogy in the Foucauldian sense, if this is a method, or if I can construe it as a method, does it have any form of justification? So how do we arrive at that there was a concept of sexuality which came into being in early modern times or whatever? And is it different from anything more traditional like source criticism, where you infer by certain? And This then brings me to something else. If I take the evidentiary road, so I think about the evidence first, then we might very well have situations, right, where we know that there's a concept and maybe know what that concept means about the past, but we don't know about the practices in which this concept is embedded, right? I mean, this is conceivable, right? Because we can infer concepts via text, and in text we have logical relations, right? We can sort of it's used in that way. So we need to know language it is put in and something, but we don't necessarily know the practices which it is linked or must be linked, right? At least it's conceivable that that is the case. That these things come apart, at least in the past. And then maybe a second part to this question, just very generally, if what I just said is basically perhaps what the historiography of concept comes down to in this Foucauldian and Wittgensteinian key, what is the difference to what is called conceptual history in this sort of Koselekian fashion, which I don't know very well, but I just know that this is also you're muted, I think. That this is also discussed a lot. So maybe these are two questions, or take one of them only if you feel like, but thanks.
No, thanks, Georg. These are wonderful questions and very hard for me to answer as well, which is great. I'll start with the final one. I don't know Koselleck at all, so I mean I should. It's on my reading list for the future. So
we got something in common here. I don't know it very well.
The best I can do is promise to read and think about it and discuss with you possibly in the future as well. I mean, I appreciate the fact that you want to pin me down, and you should want to pin me down and say, so, okay, but what are you saying? What are you taking from Foucault and what are you taking from Wittgenstein? I'm not really recommending this kind of new way of doing history of concepts, but and by taking this insight from Wittgenstein and taking this sort of method from Foucault. I mean, fair for. It's only fair to want an answer on that. I was more trying to sort of to point out some logical insights that would apply also to some of the things Foucault is doing in that tradition. So one way of thinking my concern with this stuff, it might not be same or very fruitful for your concern, is to make a little bit sense of what Foucault is actually doing in a more sort of analytic key. So that's what I've been sort of trying to do a little bit, but at the same time I do have in the background all sorts of other debates and thinkers. I mentioned Collingwood, and Josie was sort of kind enough to take that up. Okay, so the historiography of concepts. I mean, as far as I'll be frank, I don't have anything technical to recommend here in any sense. I'm a bit skeptical about this distinction of text versus practice, although I recognize that you might get something and not know what it is. But I mean, there's an element in which the characterization of something takes care of some of those links, even though you might not have independent evidence for that. So, for example, to characterize something as a diary. And not necessarily unpack what we understand as a diary being, but how did the 15th century Spaniards use diaries, for example? So if this is a diary, then we have a sense of how to read it. So I mean, I don't have any recommendations to make to historians at all, obviously, but I imagine that it's a kind of a piecing together these connections, perhaps by having independent evidence about what the practice of writing these things, or having a record of people writing these things, or having a sense of what kind of writing techniques, or having a sense of how they spent their whole day and when they devoted time to writing, and who actually wrote. Maybe it was only the aristocracy, as one would imagine, and all these kind of things. So all that would go into understanding a piece of text as a diary. And once you understand a piece of text as a diary, then the practice link is already established in that way, and so I think the kind of text practice link is more of a conceptual thing. So really, if you don't understand what something is, it doesn't quite stand as a text by itself. I mean, it stands as an artifact. But to understand what's written in something is to see its connection, to an extent, to practice. So I think the point that Wittgenstein would make is more of a logical one, rather than saying that it's possible to have a text on its own without the practice. So yeah, historiography of concepts. I don't have anything novel, certainly, or even not that novel to recommend. In terms of the justification, I take it you mean justification as to why we should read something a certain way, rather than why that something is true or valid, why a statement is true or valid.
No, I'll take it in the way why it's valid. Why
it's valid, yes.
Yeah. How we
Well,
infer
I mean,
that the concept has been used as well.
Well, I mean, that's another part of the talk where I wasn't going to provide an answer, but at least a hint towards the problem. And I think the problem is, I mean, Foucault is usually criticized for not being explicit about what's wrong with this regime of sexuality, or what's wrong with a particular form of disciplinary power, what he calls disciplinary power. So he's thought to be a kind of a crypto-normative thinker, that he's got a view of what should be, but he's not telling us and sort of recommending that. But I think that one of the problems here is not that I mean, one of the problems here is that there's a different sense of what critical terms are appropriate for propositions and for concepts and for practices. So concepts can be, unwieldy or elegant or useful or impractical or pointless or whatever, but concepts are not true or false. It doesn't make sense to say a concept is true or false. So in that sense, that's one of the difficulties that both Wittgenstein sort of is responding to, or when he talks about the arbitrariness of grammar, that it's not responsive to reality in the sense that, well, that's the grammar we have because reality is that way. But also, and that's the same thing with Foucault in a way, because the kind of cryptonormativity, or the kind of not saying anything, I think reflects the difficulty of evaluating, this kind of the grammar of human beings, for example, having a sexuality, and that sexuality being of 3, 4, 5, 10 different types. I mean, you can play that game, and people are playing that game, but is that a better game to play than the game of saying that, all way we should think about sex is whether we are doing things in moderation or in excess, as some might say the ancients would think like that? Is that a better game to play than the other one? I don't think there's an obvious answer here, which is the nature of the difficulty. But it certainly is not a propositional claim that can be assessed directly as to its validity. It's a matter of, the applicability, the convenience, perhaps the implications, and so on of that. So something like that, I would say.
Oh, yeah, thank you. I think we had a conceptual muddle of our own here. I didn't mean validity in that sense. I meant it in a sort of epistemic justification. It doesn't matter. We can talk about it later.
Sorry, Gerbs.
No. It was just as much me we have. But let's see if there's other people who have some question or comments who haven't had the chance to yet. Is there someone? Well.
Yeah,
Arto, did you? Yes, sorry, yes, Arto, please.
Yeah, thanks for the very nice presentation. So I would like to ask one thing about when you had this the picture of tanks. So that kind of triggered or inspired me to think about that. This now when you're talking about history of concepts, so like, how do you see this alternative conceptualizations here? Because something like 1989 Tiananmen Square massacre could be conceptualized in a lot of different ways, that this single event might become part of different kinds of historical trajectories. So how do you see these kind of alternative frameworks or alternatives to conceptualize different kind of events?
Thank you very much for the question. I'm not sure the kind of observations and remarks I offered would distinguish necessarily between, different political histories of events that could be seen as liberatory struggles or inconvenient sort of insurgencies and counter-revolutionary sort of, So I don't think the kind of considerations I offered would distinguish between that. And so I certainly don't mean to offer a criterion as to, what is the correct way of viewing that historical event. I think it's more of, the kind of comparability of that social setting for that kind of thing to happen, and how it might, for example, differ to, a kind of an uprising in Rome, or a war, and that would make it a kind of a conceptually different beast because of its relations to all sorts of other things. I think that's what I would focus on. And the question you're asking, which is obviously very important too, I think is of a different order to the kind of concerns I was raising.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, great. Then I suggest I'll ask one more time. I mean, we are already here, 1 hour, 40 minutes, which is great. But so is there any question, comments, concern? Ask now or remain quiet until next time, I guess. Well, I don't think so. Then it remains for me to say thank you very much, Leonidas, and thank you very much, everybody else.
Thank you.
And we'll reconvene on the 21st of March when Adam Timmins will be speaking about realism and anti-realism and related concerns, which has a connection to today. So I hope to see you all again, and until next time, bye-bye.